Nikkita Oliver notes that 2020 brought to our attention the importance and the necessity of organizers who can galvanize a community to action and help us find our own role in improving the world around us. And so I'd like to introduce the first keynote speaker of the conference, Seattle-based creative, organizer, abolitionist, educator, and attorney, Nikkita Oliver. They are the executive director of Creative Justice, an arts-based alternative to incarceration and a healing, engaged, youth-led community program. They are also the first political candidate of the Seattle's People's Party in the 2017 mayoral race and just recently announced their bid for the Seattle City Council. Nikkita strives to create experiences which draw us closer to our humanity and invites us to imagine what we hope to see in the future. That's who we need to hear from. With that, I'll give it over to Nikkita. Thank you.
We've been having conversations for a long time in our region about the issues of the school to prison pipeline, and yet we continue to invest in all of the things that actually perpetuate that pipeline. So I ask you, where is our 2030 plan? How are we going to get ourselves to the place where we no longer use cages or punitive systems of justice as our response to when harm occurs or when harm could occur? Because there's so many things that happen in our communities that are actually preventable. How is this connected to thinking about graduate Tacoma? Well, let's start drawing the lines here. The school to prison pipeline is an intricate pipeline of connected systems and institutions that have been invested in the pushing of children, in particular, Black, Native, and Brown children, low-income children, into the prison system for the purpose of creating a poor, working group of people that can be utilized to keep our system going. Now, some folks are thinking, Nikkita, that's a big claim. How do I know that? Well, I know it because when we look at history, when we said that we ended slavery as we knew it, chattel slavery when it started, we moved into a complex system of incarceration. The first step in that was what was called the convict leasing program. And there were a number of laws that were created to make just the way that Black people lived illegal. Being outside was illegal. How you parented your children, if it didn't match the way society said, white society said it should happen, was illegal. If there were too many of us gathered, made illegal. And we were put in prisons and then leased out for the purpose of having very cheap labor. Now, humans are good people inherently, I believe, and folks saw that this was wrong. And once again, there was a movement to end this way of incarcerating people and using them for exploited labor. But the system is also crafty. It continues to evolve in a way that we see people pushed into prisons and used and exploited in this way for the purpose of labor. And our children are also pushed into these same pipelines in order to continue to support the way in which the roots of this country started. So we need to really start getting deep into understanding what is the root of the problem, how does this connect to our school system, and what are we going to do about it? In the United States, we see incarceration used at a growing rate as opposed to educational opportunities. $75 billion a year is spent on incarceration, whereas $65 billion is spent on sending young people to education. So that's our college funding versus our correction system funding. It can cost $100,000 per year to incarcerate a person, and in some states, it's way more, and in other states, it's less. Whereas on average, it's $10,000 per year to make somebody a student. And we have over 20 prisons that are built in states like California since the 1980s, and one university built in that same state since the 1980s. So we are rapidly growing the prison industrial complex while slowly growing our educational opportunities for young people. And so Why do we have the discrepancy? Why invest more in punitive responses to behavior we don't like, rather than invest more in the educational opportunities that are most likely to keep young people out of the school to prison pipeline in the first place? And also, it's worth acknowledging that the United States incarcerates more people than any other nation. We have 25% of the world's incarcerated population, and yet we are number 65 when it comes to the global college population. And those are staggering statistics for us to think about when we grapple with the reason why the school to prison pipeline continues to grow, why the prison industrial complex continues to grow, and yet our educational opportunities for Black, Brown, Native young people continues to decrease. So just how our cities have analyzed the problem of issues around traffic fatalities and deaths, how we're analyzing the problem around the environmental crisis we're facing. We really should be doing the same thing when it comes to issues around the school to prison pipeline. One thing that immediately comes to mind for me, thinking about the 1980s and the 1990s. I was going to play a video for you, a short clip of Hillary Clinton talking about the super predator myth, but I'll just break it down for you. Essentially, there was a period of time where we became so afraid of young Black people, and in particular, young Black boys, that we created a myth that they were a super predator, that there was this whole population of young Black boys that did not have any type of remorse, feelings, or care for other humans around them. And that became the foundation of how we developed the tough on crime era laws. This was very much applied to our children, and the remnants of it exist still in the state of Washington. An example of this are auto decline laws. Auto decline means that there are certain crimes for which young people are automatically sent to adult court. They're not even viewed as or treated as juveniles, despite the fact that we have a juvenile justice system. Even though, while I would say that system is inadequate, we still view certain children and certain offenses as things that are only adult-like. And rather than using things that are age-appropriate and brain development appropriate, we respond in ways that were developed during this tough on crime era. We also have discretionary decline, which means young people as young as 14 can be sent to adult court for certain crimes. So again, ignoring what we know about brain science. We know that young people's brains are not fully developed until the age of 25. So why do we continue to enforce laws, to use penal systems that do not actually respond to the needs of our young people? We know that young people have very specific experiences in our schools. The culture of our schools is not culturally reflective of Black and Brown young people. It often denies the historical and cultural gifts and significance that those young folks have brought to, that our families, our history, our ancestors have brought to the world. These are spaces where the behavior, as we already heard from the data, is often criminalized of Black, Brown, and Native young folks. And it's really important that we begin to understand how this creates climates where young people are not able to learn, unable to focus, and then their behavior is criminalized. There are also many other determinants: housing, displacement, exclusionary zoning, lack of access to income and wealth, neighborhoods and zip codes that are over-policed, lack of access to certain resources like 0 to 5 supports from birth until we go to the grave. There should be supports that support human development. Tough on crime era laws, over-policing, historical and present, systemic oppression, and disenfranchisement are all at the root of why we see the school to prison pipeline continue to exist. So what can we do? And I'll finish here. We can build self-awareness to do the work to change. The first thing, why are we still using punitive systems and responses in our schools when young people exhibit behavior that may not be conducive for the educational environment? We know about restorative practices. We know about community schools. We know that when we provide healthcare opportunities, other types of supports in our schools, we actually make that environment more welcoming for families and students. They're more likely to learn, more likely to be engaged, and to have basic needs met. We also know that individual accountability is not the only way to go. Educators, administrators, and the community around our schools contributes to why young people struggle in the classroom and also contribute to why we still see the school to prison pipeline being used. We need to grow and think about collective accountability. How are we as educators going to take accountability for what's happening in our classrooms, the biases and prejudices that we bring in? How are we as administrators going to ensure that our schools have more supports and resources, that our school district is built around the basic things, the basic necessities that ensure that young people and families can thrive? How are we as elected officials making sure that our cities provide housing, economic opportunity, educational opportunity, clean water, healthy food, and access to healthcare so that all families can thrive in our school system? I do believe it is possible, and I want to admonish us, what is our 2030 plan to end the use of cages and surveillance and rather move towards restorative practices that develop school districts and educational climates and environments where every young person can thrive?
Nikkita, thank you. That was such a powerful way to begin my morning, and I say that as a member of the education community. My name is Tennille Jeffries Simmons, and I am the Chief of Staff at Washington State's Education Department, also known as the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, OSPI. Some of you may have noticed the irony that one institutional leader introduced Nikkita Oliver, and then I, another institutional leader, will help moderate our Q&A. That was intentional. And of those listening today who occupy roles within the system, myself included, we must be willing to challenge our thinking. Eliminating long-standing, persistent racial disparities for students requires real-life creativity. So I've got a number of questions for you in our limited time, and I'm going to start with the first one. Nikkita, how would you describe the difference between the complicity of an institution and the complicity of an individual when considering institutional racism?
That is a great question. You know, I always ask myself about sphere of influence, power, and authority when I try to determine my own accountability and what I should be responsible for. Do I have the ability to push back on this? Do I have the sphere of influence? Do I have authority to make the change? I think all of us have a sphere of influence. And we have people who, when we speak up and we challenge oppression or injustice, that we can influence into seeing things a different way. And then we enter into things like power and authority. I think about community-based power a lot, which is where I think our sphere of influence as individuals is most important. Your ability to mobilize, galvanize, politically educate people is something that we all have within us, and it's something we can all do within our community. And there are people in our sphere of influence that if receiving the right information would probably join us in mobilizing to change something, right? And so then there's power in that. There's power in our ability to mobilize our communities. And then we start to think about the authority piece. Who has the ability to make the change or shift the dollars or change the policy? And that is where, once we've mobilized, I ask, who do we need to be putting the pressure on? Who do we need to be going and visiting? Who do we need to lobby? And so really encouraging people, when we think about individual complicity versus systemic complicity, is where are you failing to exercise your sphere of influence? Where are you not mobilizing and galvanizing the community around you? And then once y'all have mobilized and galvanized, do you all have knowledge of the systems of authority to be pushing them in the right way to make specific changes? And so a big part of this is also building our analysis, is understanding history, is doing the self-awareness work and the political education work with each other. So when we get that moment of critical mass where we have community-based power, can we then push the authority to make the change? So as individuals, I think we're most complicit when we deny our sphere of influence. Systems, though, are often complicit in the sense that there's nothing new under the sun. I don't think that these systems are unaware that the problems of racial disproportionality, the school to prison pipeline, over policing, mass incarceration exist. And in fact, when I think about educators in specific, a lot of our educators do know, and a lot of our administrators do know. And that is where I think our individual complicity also changes. If you are in a position of power and you have the ability to push the bounds on what is happening and what is possible, it is actually your duty to do that, to set things right. And so people have to be willing to accept, be accountable for where we are actually a part of complicit systems, and we are allowing that system to remain complicit. And I think that's where individual complicity and systemic complicity start to intersect. And that requires a certain amount of self-awareness and accountability to say, am I the person that's actually allowing this to stay as it is? And do I need to be pushing harder from the place that I am on the inside of the problem? Because my previous comments were about folks who are typically on the outside of the problem. And that's not like a clear cut. I think about educators who are both inside, outside often, but really doing that assessment about sphere of influence, power, and authority, and having the ability to assess when you should be the one that needs to be making the moves.